I observe in these decisive years the dramatic end of a 500-year epoch of French grandeur that, from François I through Louis XIV to Charles de Gaulle, shaped the face of Europe. What is unfolding under Emmanuel Macron's presidency qualitatively surpasses all previous crisis cycles of the Fifth Republic, and marks the transition from a proud nation to a divided society on the brink of internal collapse. France's claim to European leadership proves to be a nostalgic illusion unmasked by structural weaknesses, demographic upheavals and social fragmentation. This transformation is particularly tragic because it signifies the end of the last authentic European great power. While Germany retained its status as an economic power and Britain as a financial centre, France until recently represented the ideal of a sovereign European nation, militarily autonomous, culturally influential and politically independent. The loss of this role leaves a strategic vacuum in Europe that neither Germany nor other rising powers can fill. The speed of French decomposition surprises even pessimistic observers. Within a generation, the country transformed from Mitterrand's force tranquille into Macron's fragmented republic, in which urban elites and the peripheral population live in parallel realities. The yellow vests, the banlieue riots, and the rise of the extremes signal not merely dissatisfaction but the loss of a shared national narrative. France's current crisis is rooted in systematic self-deception about the real foundations of national power since the end of the colonial era. The Fifth Republic constructed its legitimacy on the illusion of French exceptionalism justified by nuclear deterrence, diplomatic finesse, and cultural hegemony. This ideology of grandeur prevented the necessary adaptation to changing geopolitical realities. De Gaulle's concept of a certain idea of France was based on the premise that France could exercise influence through strategic autonomy and moral authority without possessing corresponding demographic or economic resources. This strategy functioned during the Cold War when France's equidistance between the superpowers created room for maneuver. It failed completely, however, in a multipolar world in which power is determined primarily by economic performance and demographic vitality. The economic foundation of French power has been eroding continuously since the 1980s. France lost its industrial competitiveness to Germany, its innovative strength to the United States, and its cost advantages to Eastern Europe and Asia. At the same time, the French social model prevented the structural reforms that allowed other European countries to adapt to globalization. Particularly disastrous was the decision to use the euro as an instrument to limit German power. France hoped that through monetary union it could tame Germany while simultaneously benefiting from its economic dynamism. Instead, the euro cemented German dominance and reduced France to a permanently deficit-ridden junior partner. Demographic developments intensify these economic problems exponentially. France is aging rapidly, while at the same time massive immigration from Africa and the Middle East undermines social cohesion. This double demographic challenge overwhelms the French welfare system and creates ethnic and religious tensions that threaten national unity. The banlieues have developed into quasi-autonomous areas in which French state authority can only be enforced to a limited extent. This development is not merely social decline but a territorial loss of state sovereignty. When a state can no longer control parts of its territory, it loses its legitimacy as a political unit. France now operates as a delusional hegemon that seeks to mask its dwindling real power through rhetorical grandeur and diplomatic activism. Macron's concept of European sovereignty is less a visionary strategy than a desperate attempt to preserve French leadership through European integration. This strategy fails, however, in the face of the reality that other European countries have neither the capacity nor the willingness to finance French ambitions. Macron's personal leadership style reinforces these strategic weaknesses. His Jupiterian rhetoric and his claim to intellectual superiority irritate other European leaders and systematically isolate France. Whereas Merkel built trust through willingness to compromise and technocratic competence, Macron creates mistrust through moral arrogance and shifting positions. French weakness is particularly evident in foreign policy. Macron's Russia policy oscillated between naive willingness for dialogue and helpless confrontation, without achieving strategic coherence. His telephone calls with Putin during the Ukraine crisis demonstrated French irrelevance. Moscow listened politely, but systematically ignored French positions. Africa policy is collapsing as former colonies emancipate themselves from French tutelage and turn towards new patrons such as China or Russia. Mali, Burkina Faso and Niger ended their cooperation with French armed forces, while the Wagner Group and Chinese investors replace French influence. Even within the EU, France is systematically losing influence to Germany and Eastern European countries. Macron's initiative for a European political community was received skeptically by Eastern European states that do not recognize French leadership. His demands for strategic autonomy vis-à-vis the United States find no support, as other European countries prefer American security guarantees to French promises. The French army, traditionally a symbol of national independence, suffers from chronic underfunding and strategic overstretch. Interventions in Mali, the Central African Republic and Côte d'Ivoire exceed French capacities and tie up resources without achieving strategic objectives. At the same time, France neglects its European defense commitments, thereby weakening its position within NATO. Germany uses French weakness to consolidate its own European hegemony. While France rhetorically claims European leadership, Germany controls the economic levers of the EU and systematically enforces German priorities. Berlin increasingly treats Paris as a secondary partner whose approval is desirable but not essential. Eastern European countries, particularly Poland and the Baltic states, completely ignore French leadership claims and orient themselves directly towards the United States. These countries regard French diplomacy as naive and unreliable and prefer American security guarantees to French promises. Italy is developing into a systematic competitor to French Mediterranean ambitions. While France loses influence in Africa, Italy builds relations with North African countries and positions itself as an alternative European power in the Mediterranean region. This competition weakens both countries, but Italy possesses greater economic resources and demographic stability. Britain, although weakened after Brexit, retains in many areas more global influence than France. London remains the most important European financial centre, while French attempts to establish Paris as an alternative have failed. British soft power through language, universities and media far surpasses French cultural policy. I recognize in France's development three critical escalation paths that go beyond political crises and threaten the existence of the French Republic as a coherent political unit. First, territorial fragmentation intensifies into a systematic erosion of state control. The banlieues are developing into de facto autonomous areas with their own rules, their own economy and their own authority structures. These parallel societies compete with the French state for loyalty and legitimacy and create alternative identities incompatible with French citizenship. Even today, French police can enter many districts only with massive forces, while drug trafficking and clan crime systematically undermine state authority. This development is irreversible, as the French government possesses neither the political support nor the operational capacities to regain control over these areas. Second, economic divergence leads to a systematic division between winners and losers of globalization. While urban elites in Paris, Lyon and other centers benefit from European integration, the peripheral population is impoverished by deindustrialization and economic decline. This division is not only economic but cultural and political. The Yellow Vest protests already documented this fundamental alienation between France d'en haut and France d'en bas. This divide deepens continuously, as Macron's reform policy systematically favors urban elites and neglects rural areas. The result is permanent political polarization that makes democratic governance impossible. Third, the identity crisis escalates into an existential conflict over the definition of French nationality. The rise of Marine Le Pen and the simultaneous radicalization of the left reflect fundamental disagreements about France's future. These differences cannot be resolved through compromise, as they concern existential questions. Who is French? What does French identity mean? What role does Islam play in French society? I project three likely development paths from the current French crisis. In the first scenario, persistent social fragmentation leads to the Confederated Republic. France does not formally disintegrate, but in practice fragments into autonomous regions with differing rules and identities. Paris retains formal control, but regions such as Brittany, Corsica and Alsace develop de facto autonomy. The banlieue become quasi-independent enclaves, while rural areas develop their own conservative governance structures. In the second scenario, Le Pen's electoral victory leads to the illiberal republic, which attempts to restore French unity through authoritarian means. Such a government would apply massive repression against immigrant communities, leave the EU and pursue a nationalist economic policy. This strategy might strengthen national cohesion in the short term but would isolate France internationally and weaken it economically. In the third scenario, persistent weakness leads to the German client state, in which France abandons its autonomy and aligns itself as a junior partner to Germany. This development would fundamentally destroy French identity but could ensure economic stability and political order. Germany would de facto control the whole of continental Europe. Macroeconomic indicators document France's systematic decline in comparison with other European countries. While Germany strengthened its export position and Italy implemented structural reforms, France stagnated across all relevant indicators. The French economy grows more slowly, is less innovative, and continuously loses market share. Particularly devastating is the collapse of French industrial companies. Peugeot-Citroën merged with Italy's Fiat. Alstom was taken over by General Electric, while Airbus is increasingly dominated by German partners. This development is not accidental but an expression of structural French weaknesses: high labor costs, rigid labor laws, and bureaucratic obstacles. French public finances are in a permanent state of crisis. Despite record tax burdens, France cannot finance its expenditure and systematically accumulates debt. This indebtedness limits political room for maneuver and makes France dependent on the forbearance of its EU partners. What I recognize in France's agony is not merely the end of a national grandeur, but the collapse of the idea that European middle powers can play independent roles in a globalized world. France's failure demonstrates the limits of European ambition and the reality of American and Chinese dominance. The tragedy lies in the fact that France could have avoided its problems through realistic policy. Structural reform, demographic adjustment, and foreign policy modesty could have stabilized the country. Instead, France chose the path of denial and missed the moment for necessary adjustments. The coming years will show whether France can find a new role as a regional middle power or sink into the chaos of internal conflicts. For Europe, France's decline means the end of the Franco-German motor and the transition to a German hegemony that weakens and destabilizes Europe. France's legacy will be to have demonstrated that grandeur without corresponding resources leads to self-destruction.